Georgie Sloane put 2 rounds through the front door of her print shop on a Tuesday afternoon, and when the man didn't come back through it, she stood behind the counter, with the piece still in her hand, and listened to the street go quiet, and thought about Father Dario Salcedo. She thought about him the way you think about the person whose decision just put a killer in your shop. If you've ever had someone drift out of your life without an explanation, and then spent years building walls to make sure it never happened again, this one's for you. Welcome to Strong Mind Stories, character-driven stories with a twist you won't see coming, and an emotional truth you probably will. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more. Let's get into it. The man had come in at 2:47. Georgie knew the time because she always checked the clock when the bell above the door rang. A habit built over 20 years of keeping track of things nobody else was keeping track of. She'd been at the work table in the back when he came in, trimming the edges off a California driver's license made out to a name that didn't belong to the woman who'd ordered it. She slid it under the blotter and came to the counter. The man was somewhere in his 50s, built like someone who'd done physical work for a long time and stopped but kept the frame. His face had the particular weathering of a man who'd spent years outdoors in a hot country, and his eyes moved across the shop the way a hunter's eyes move across unfamiliar ground. Not curious, cataloging. He wore a dark jacket too heavy for the weather and stood with his weight slightly forward, like a man who expected to move quickly and wanted to be ready. He had the particular kind of stillness that isn't calm. Taking his time at the entrance, he looked at the shop the way a man looks at a place when he's confirming it matches something he memorized earlier. Then he looked at Georgie and said, in English that had been learned late, "You make papers." It wasn't a question. Georgie said, "I make wedding invitations." His eyes dropped to the counter. They moved to her hands. 3 weeks ago, he said, a man named Celestino Fuentes. No answer from her. One hand dropped below the counter. The piece had been in the drawer under the register for 9 years. She'd put it there after Vargas. After Vargas, she'd put a lot of things in place. The referral-only policy, the cash-only rule, the habit of noting the clock when someone came in, so that if anything went wrong, she'd at least know the time. What she'd learned from Vargas wasn't what people learn from a man who hurts them. It was something quieter and harder to name. He'd overstayed his visa, and when they sent him back to Chile, they'd promised each other they'd find a way. Calls, plans, eventually a path back in. For about 3 months he'd meant it. Then the calls got shorter, then less frequent. Then 1 week there was no call and she told herself he was busy, and the week after that she told herself the same thing. And somewhere in the month that followed, she stopped telling herself anything and just waited. And the waiting eventually became the answer. He hadn't left. He'd just stopped arriving. She'd spent a long time trying to locate the moment it had ended so she could point to it and say, "There." That's where it broke. But there was no moment. Just the slow accumulation of unreturned messages and the specific silence of a person who has decided, quietly and without ceremony, that what you had together wasn't worth the effort of an honest goodbye. The piece went into the drawer because she'd decided that if she was going to keep doing this work, she was going to do it without leaving herself open in the ways she'd been open before. Not to the work, not to the people in it. The work you could manage. The people were the variable you couldn't control, and she'd already paid the tuition on that lesson once. The man reached into his jacket. She didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. The first round went through the display stand of sample cardstock between them. The second caught him going through the door, a grunt, the sidewalk, boots scraping, finding purchase. Then nothing, just the ordinary sound of Silver Lake moving past the front of a print shop, where a woman stood with a piece in her hand, 2 shell casings on the floor, and a hole in the door she was going to have to explain to someone. The piece went back on the counter. 2:49 on the clock. She called Father Salcedo. 6 rings, no answer. Called again. Same result. Phone down. She'd known Dario Salcedo for 11 years, trusted his referrals for 8 of them. In 8 years he'd never sent her anyone who wasn't exactly what they said they were. And the system she'd built around that trust was the same system that had just kept her alive by 2 seconds. Which meant the system worked and the trust didn't. And she needed to understand which of those 2 facts was going to matter more in the next few hours. Broom from the closet. Shell casings swept into her palm and pocketed. The hole in the door was going to need more than a broom. She went to the back room, cut a sheet of foam board to fit, and taped it over from both sides. It looked bad. It looked like a repair, which was close enough. Sign flipped to closed. She sat behind the counter. 3 miles east, in a motel room on Cesar Chavez that charged by the week and asked no questions about the name on the registration, a man named Adolfo Reyes sat on the edge of the bed and pressed a folded hand towel against his left shoulder and waited for the bleeding to slow. It was slowing. That was something. He'd been shot before. Once in Guadalajara in 2007, once in a parking structure in San Jose in 2014. Both times he'd walked away. He was going to walk away from this one too. From the bag on the floor he took a photograph. Celestino Fuentes, 11 years ago, outside a government building in San Salvador. Reyes had been carrying it for 9 years. 3 others were in the bag alongside it, different men, different cities, different decades. Celestino was the one he'd come closest to finishing. 3 times close. 3 times the man had slipped away. The woman in the print shop had good reflexes. He'd give her that. Pressing harder on the towel, he thought about what came next. The shop's address he already had. A second address had taken him 4 months to trace. A priest in East LA, St. Agatha's, connected to the shop through a chain of names he'd pulled one at a time like thread from a fraying hem. He checked the address on his phone, put the phone away. Then he looked at the ceiling and waited, the specific, unhurried quality of attention that had kept him employed and alive for 15 years. The shoulder would be a problem for a few days. After that, it would be manageable. After that, there was still the priest. He could wait. He was good at it. Georgie sat behind the counter and thought about 3 weeks ago. She thought about the referral. She thought about the 8 years of referrals before it, and how each one had added a layer to the trust she'd placed in a priest she'd never actually asked about his work, because asking would have required her to tell him about hers, and she'd decided a long time ago that the only safe version of the arrangement was the one where neither of them said too much. That arrangement had worked for 8 years. That arrangement had a man with late-learned English and a weapon walking through her door on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about that. The man who'd come in on that Tuesday had been referred by Father Salcedo, which meant he'd cleared the first question before he walked through the door. His name was Celestino Fuentes. 61 years old, or he said he was, with the particular stillness of someone who'd gotten very good at waiting without looking like he was waiting. He'd brought the photograph already cut to size, matte finish, exact specifications Georgie required and published nowhere. She'd noted it. Assumed the priest had coached him on what to bring. 4 days to make his documents. He picked them up without ceremony, said thank you the way people say it when they mean it as a fact rather than a courtesy, and left. And now a man built like a wall and carrying a name she recognized had come through her door asking about Celestino, and she had 2 shell casings in her pocket and a piece on the counter and no answer from the priest. She turned the TV on. She needed something in the room that wasn't the sound of what had just happened. She kept it on low and went to the back and started pulling files, because if the man knew about Celestino, he might know about others, and if he knew about others, she needed to know which ones before he came back. She'd pulled 4 files and found nothing useful when the bell above the door rang. She came out of the back with the piece in her hand. Father Salcedo stood in the entrance. His eyes moved across the shop the way they always did when he arrived somewhere new, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read a room before he entered it fully. The foam board patch on the door, the piece on the counter, the shell casings that weren't there anymore but that he could see had been there, the way you can see the shape of something that's been removed. Then he looked at Georgie. "Are you hurt?" he said. It wasn't the question she expected. Not what happened, not who was it. Just the one question that went straight to her, and something about that made it harder to answer than it should have been. "No," she said, "I'm not hurt." He came to the counter and set a wooden box on it between them, lid open. He said, "I got your calls. I know you got my calls. I needed to come in person. I couldn't say what I needed to say over a phone. 2 hours ago a man came through that door asking about Celestino Fuentes," she said. "He reached into his jacket. I put 2 rounds into the front of my own shop to get him out of it. He's wounded and he's still out there, and you're telling me you couldn't say what you needed to say over a phone?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said, "say it." He told her about Celestino first, the charges the news had and the 43 people the news didn't. The warehouse. 11 days. The soldiers who came looking and found nothing. He told her about the hunter. 9 years, 3 near misses. A man who worked his way through networks the way you work through a lock, one tumbler at a time. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known the hunter was getting close?" 2 weeks, the word landed between them and neither of them picked it up right away. 2 weeks, she said again, not as a question. I was trying to manage it. I thought I could move Celestino before it became your problem. It became my problem 2 hours ago. I know. You should have called me. Yes, he said, I should have. She'd expected him to qualify it, to explain the thinking, to give her the architecture of the decision. He didn't. He just agreed, and the plainness of it stopped her for a moment. She looked at the box. What is that? Look, inside her documents. Not originals but copies, each one paper, clipped to a small index card covered in the priest's handwriting. Careful, compressed. The writing of someone who'd learned to fit a life into 3 lines. She picked up the first card. Resettled in Fresno. Works in agriculture. 3 grandchildren. The next passed 2017. Renal failure. Died with his name. The next teaching English in Sacramento. Asked about you once. I told her I didn't have contact information. She went through them slowly now. 22 cards in all. Some ran several lines, some were a single sentence. One said only, "Still here." She was near the bottom when the priest reached across the counter and moved one card to the top of the remaining stack. He didn't say anything, just placed it where she'd see it next. She picked it up. The date at the top was 11 years ago. Her name was at the top. She read it. She will ask the right questions and she will be right about most of the answers. She built the system after Vargas. The walls are load-bearing. Don't press on them and don't try to take them down. What she does, she believes in. She has been carrying enough for long enough already. Don't add to it. Let her work be clean. She read it twice. When she set it down, her hand was flat on the counter and she didn't move it. You wrote this before you sent me anyone, she said. Yes. Before I was ever part of this. Yes, you knew about Vargas before we had any kind of arrangement. Yes, I never told you about Vargas. No, he said. You didn't. The shop was quiet. Outside, the street did what streets do. Carried on without knowing, cars going past, someone's music for a moment, and then gone. How, she said. The community is small. People talk, not about details, about shapes, the shape of someone who's been hurt in a particular way. I recognized yours. She didn't say anything to that. I want to ask you something, she said finally. And I want you to answer it honestly. All right, in 11 years. Did you ever think about saying something? Not fixing it, not explaining what you knew, just acknowledging it. Saying, I know something happened to you and I see that it changed how you work, and I'm not going to push on it, but I want you to know that I see it. He was quiet for long enough that she knew the answer before he gave it. Yes, he said. Many times, but you didn't know why. He straightened upon her counter, the way he always did when a conversation was pressing on something real. Because I told myself it wasn't my place, he said. Because I told myself you'd built your walls for a reason, and it wasn't my job to knock on them. He paused. Because it was easier. The last part came out quieter than the rest. Easier, she said. I'm not proud of it. I've spent 30 years keeping everyone at a careful distance, and I told myself it was for their protection, and it was, partly. But partly it was because getting close to people cost something, and I'd already paid more than I knew how to carry. He looked at the box. Rosa taught me that, or I told myself she did. I'm not sure anymore how much was her lesson, and how much was just me deciding to stop being someone people could reach. Georgie said, Tell me about her. He looked up. You've never asked me that before, he said. I'm asking now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the stool from behind the counter, her stool, the one she never offered, and sat down on it, and she didn't stop him. She was 26, he said. When I met her, she was already doing the work. She found me, not the other way around. She had a gift for it, for making people feel safe, for making the machinery of it seem like something other than what it was. He stopped. She had a laugh that she used on purpose. She knew exactly what it did to a room, and she used it like a tool. That sounds like a small thing. I've thought about it almost every day for 30 years. He folded his hands on the counter. When they came for her, I was in Guatemala City. By the time I got back, she'd been missing for 4 days. I didn't know for another 3 weeks what the 4 days had meant. He paused. What 4 days means when soldiers have someone and want answers. The shop was very still. Georgie didn't move. She didn't give them anything, he said. Not one name, not one location, not one piece of what she knew, which was everything. He stopped. I have spent 30 years trying to decide whether that makes me feel more grateful or more guilty. I still don't have an answer. He looked at Georgie directly. Her name was Rosa. After that, I put everything into the box. Everything I know stays in here or it stays with me. Nobody carries it home. Nobody carries it out into the world where it can be found and used. He stopped. That was the rule I made. That was the distance I kept. Georgie had been looking at the foam board patch on the door. She turned back to him. Sorry about Rosa, she said. It was simple. She meant it completely. He nodded once, the way you nod when something lands that you've waited a long time to receive. I know you are, he said. They stayed in that for a moment, both of them standing in the presence of something that had just become visible between them, and neither of them looking away from it. Then Georgie picked up the card he'd written about her. She read it again. Let her work be clean. She set it down. You should have told me what Celestino was, she said. All of it. You would have said no, maybe, maybe not, but it was my choice to make. She stopped. That's what I keep coming back to. You took the choice away because you decided you knew what I'd do with it. That's not protection. That's just deciding for someone. Yes, he said, it is. She waited for the qualification. It didn't come. You want to know the worst part, she said. It doesn't feel different from Vargas. That's not fair to you, and I know it's not fair, but that's where I am right now. Someone I trusted who kept me in the dark. Someone who decided what I got to know and what I didn't. Her voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. He didn't even give me the courtesy of a goodbye. He just went quiet. And I spent months telling myself he was busy. Telling myself there was a reason. And then I stopped telling myself anything, and I just reorganized around the absence. Like it was a piece of furniture I'd learned to walk around. She stopped. That was more than she'd said about Vargas out loud in 11 years. More than she'd said about him to anyone. The priest didn't say anything immediately. He didn't rush to fill the space. He just sat with what she'd given him, and she understood, watching him do it, that this was something he knew how to do. Receive something someone had been carrying alone and not make it smaller by responding too quickly. I could have been a better friend to you, he said. I knew what you were carrying, and I kept my distance from it because it was easier for me. That's the truth of it. I told myself I was respecting your walls. I was also hiding behind them. She looked at him. She stopped. Started again. I didn't expect you to say that. I know, I'm still angry. I know that too. What you did and what Vargas did are not the same thing. No, but it activated the same thing in me, and I need you to understand that. I'm not saying you're him. I'm saying that when people I trust keep me in the dark, it doesn't matter what the reason is. The feeling is the same feeling. I understand, he said. I'm sorry, Georgie. Not just for Celestino, for 11 years of keeping you at a distance when you deserved better from me. She looked at the card on the counter. Let her work be clean. You could have told me you knew, she said. At any point, yes. You could have just sat with me once. Not fixed it, not explained it. Just been someone who knew and didn't make me carry it alone. Yes, he said. I could have done that. The word hung there between them. And for a moment something in her face shifted. Not much, just a tightening around the eyes. The thing that happens when a feeling moves through a person who has gotten very good at not letting feelings be visible. You could have too, he said quietly. Told me. She looked away. That was true. She'd known he probably knew, the way you know things you've never confirmed. She'd kept it sealed because sealed was how she'd survived it. She'd been angry at him for 11 years for doing the same thing she'd been doing herself, and she could see that clearly, and it didn't make her any less angry, and somehow that was the most honest thing about the whole conversation. What you built, she said, all of this, the box, the cards, the network, you built it because of her. Yes, and you've been carrying her by yourself for 30 years. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. That's a long time to carry someone alone, she said. He didn't answer right away. It is, he said finally. She picked up the piece from the counter and put it back in the drawer. The man who came in, she said. He's wounded. I hit him on the way out. How bad? I don't know. He got up and ran. But he's still out there and he knows about you. The priest nodded. I know. He stood from the stool. He picked up the box, held it for a moment, and then set it back on the counter. I'd like to leave this here, he said. If that's all right. She looked at it. Why, because I've been carrying it alone for 30 years, he said. And maybe it's time some of it lived somewhere else. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just left the box on the counter, and he seemed to understand that was its own kind of answer. When Celestino came in, she said, the photograph he brought, the specifications, you didn't coach him. He's done this before. Other countries, other people like you. He knew what to bring. She nodded slowly. She'd assumed the priest had coached him. She'd assumed wrong. She thought about what else she'd been wrong about and whether there was a clean way to tell the difference between the things she'd gotten right and the things she'd built walls around getting wrong. She didn't think there was a clean way. She thought there might be a slow one. He moved toward the door. Dario, she said. He stopped. I'm not ready to call us even, she said. I need you to know that. I know, but I heard what you said, about Rosa, about the other thing. She stopped. I heard it. He stood in the doorway for a moment. That's enough, he said. For now, that's enough. He left. She stood behind the counter for a moment. He'd left the box. 22 cards face up inside it, in the order she'd read them. Her card on top, her name, her wound, her whole system reduced to 6 sentences in his handwriting, written 11 years ago before he'd ever called her, before he'd ever asked her for anything. She thought about what it takes to carry something like that for 11 years without once using it against the person it belonged to. She closed the lid. She set the box on the shelf behind the counter, next to the paper cutter, and the spare ink cartridges and the stack of order forms she'd been meaning to reprint for 6 months. It fit there. She turned the TV volume up slightly and went to the back and finished the 4 files she'd been pulling. None of them showed anything she needed to act on immediately. She put them away. She came back to the front. A woman knocked on the glass and pointed at the closed sign with a look of personal injury. Georgie pointed at the sign. The woman pointed at her watch. Georgie pointed at the sign again. The woman left. The street went back to being a street. Georgie stood at the counter and looked at the foam board patch on the door, and thought about the man in the motel room she didn't know about, pressing a towel against his shoulder, telling himself he could wait. She thought about what it means to be the kind of person who is still in the middle of something when you thought it was over. She'd built her whole system around not being that person. Referrals only. Cash only. Clean work, clean hands, nothing that follows you home. She looked at the box on the shelf. 11 years. He'd written her name at the top of that card 11 years ago before he'd asked her for anything, and he'd carried it in that box alongside the names of everyone else he'd ever trusted with the weight of what he was doing, and he'd kept it clean the only way he knew how. By keeping it close and keeping it quiet, and letting the people he cared about walk around in the world without knowing what he knew about what the world could do to them. Rosa. 4 days. The kind of love that looks like withholding, from the outside, when you don't know yet what it's withholding from. She wasn't ready to call it that. Wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. But the shape of it was visible now, which was more than she'd been able to say this morning. She made coffee. She was on her 2nd cup when the segment came on. She turned the sound up. A man had been brought into the emergency room at County USC with a gunshot wound to the shoulder that had become severely infected. He'd given a false name. The name had flagged. Federal custody within hours. Investigators believed he was connected to the deaths of 2 people in Mexico City and a 3rd in Guatemala, all of them living under assumed identities. His photograph came up on the screen. Georgie looked at it for a moment, then turned the sound off and finished her coffee. For a moment she stood at the counter and let it settle. The man in a hospital bed with a septic shoulder and federal agents at the door, the 43 people who'd spent 11 days in a warehouse in El Salvador and walked out the other side, the woman named Rosa who hadn't, and the priest who'd been carrying all of it in a wooden box for 30 years and had finally brought it to her shop on a Tuesday and set it on the counter between them and opened the lid. She thought about Vargas, not the way she usually thought about him, which was sideways, briefly, quickly sealed off. She thought about him directly for the first time in a long time. She thought about the 3 months of calls, the gradual thinning of them, the week she'd told herself he was busy, the months she'd spent waiting for something she already knew wasn't coming. She thought about what it had done to her, not the leaving, which she could have survived, but the not leaving. The way he'd made her uncertainty into the answer by just going quiet and letting her draw her own conclusions. She'd spent a long time after that convinced the problem was that she'd trusted him. that the lesson was about who you let in. She understood now, standing in her own shop on a Tuesday with a bullet hole in the door and a wooden box on the shelf, that she'd gotten the lesson wrong. The problem hadn't been trust. The problem had been what she'd done with the scar tissue afterward. She went to the cabinet above the coffee maker. 2 cups, the left one hers. The right one in the same position it had been in for 11 years. Not because she'd forgotten it was there, but because every time she'd looked at it, she'd thought, not yet, not today. Some other time when it doesn't cost anything. It had been costing her for 11 years. She took it down, held it for a moment, not long, just long enough. Dropped it in the trash. The sound it made was smaller than she expected, just a cup hitting the bottom of a bin, nothing marking it, nothing closing around it. She picked up her own cup and went back to the counter. Outside, the street was doing what it always did. She had orders to finish. She finished them. Thanks for listening. These stories take time to get right, and knowing you're here makes it worth it. If you want more, hit that subscribe button. And if someone in your life would connect with this, share it with them. See you next time.